going to talk a little bit about taking a physics class from face-to-face to online. And, being a physicist, I'm a big fan of models, meaning I want to see ways that things have worked before and the types of models that people have constructed to explain why they worked well. And so the one that we kind of settled on in this transition was what's called the community of inquiry framework. And it's highly focused on interactions. And so what I wanted to do, in a sense, was recreate the same types of interactions that we were doing in our face-to-face class, but in an online space. And before we do that, let's talk a little bit about what this communities of inquiry framework is. The framework focuses on various interconnected types of online presence, or in a sense, how are students and the faculty member interacting online and interacting with each other. Right, so these interconnected components consists of a teaching presence, a social presence, and a cognitive presence. So the teaching presence is concerned with the design and the implementation of the inquiries that are happening and the maintenance of the relationships with your students, right? How you promote engagement, those sorts of things. The social presence refers to the ability for your students to engage socially with the community, right? So, how do they get to engage with each other? And then the cognitive presence deals with how the interaction happens with the content itself. This framework is very interaction based, and so what it basically means is that we can think of this in terms of the interactions that are happening. Or within our teaching presence, the interactions are learner-instructor. So, what is it that I'm doing to, and what is it how is the student interacting with me? How am I interacting with the student? The social presence is how are the students interacting with each other? And then the cognitive presence is how the learner interacts with the content itself. Oftentimes, in our face-to-face classes even, we get a bit focused on our learner content interactions and our learner instructor interactions, and we miss out on the learner interactions. And that's one of the things that I spent probably a good deal of time, because it's actually a lot easier, at least I've done it quite well in a face-to-face class for a while, these sorts of student interactions through things like think, pair, share in the classroom in the middle of a lecture. We do group problem solving, cooperative group problem solving. We do group labs. We do all of the sorts of things that we would expect within a really awesome physics class. But how do we go about doing that online? So that was the one part of that I had to focus on quite a bit. So I'm going to go through these different types of interactions and how we, how I used the online space to sort of build these interactions. So the first one, right, is a learner content interaction. So the very first thing that students do when they come into some sort of new unit of learning is they watch what we call a pre-lecture, and this would be before class. And we were doing this before we had to move online. We were using these pre-lectures that students would go, and this one's actually published by Macmillan. It doesn't really matter the publisher. There's a bunch of different options, right? I like this one because it's very easy to track, right? You can see exactly how much of each video a student has watched. So as an example, this is about 15 minutes total of video, but it's broken up into chunks, into a couple of minute chunks, and you can watch and the students can see their own progression. You can see I took a snapshot of this when I was, as the pretend student, I was late, so I'm losing some credit here. But built into all of this too is also some questions, and so the students are confronted with a question, and they can't move forward until they get it right. It's multiple choice. They're going to eventually get it right, but it has built-in feedback as well. And so that feedback, it usually is built off of research and how students interact with this sort of content, and then they can move forward. Now, the idea here is that the students are going to kind of learn what it is that they don't know, because they're going to find out what they don't understand. I'm going to get histograms that tell me all about their first choices on these questions. So that gives me a lot of good information about whether or not they were really getting it from the pre-lecture. And then they're also going to take a quiz after this. Now, they get full credit for doing these. They're going to be wrong on every single one of these things, and they're going to get 100%. What it's providing me is some formative feedback, some low-stakes formative feedback and low stakes for the student, telling me what it is that the pre-lecture did and did not do a good job, or where students are still caught up and hung up in the material, and that allows a focusing of what's happening. Another type of learner content interaction would be these post-discussion videos. Now, I'll talk about the discussions here in a second, but we have these post-discussion videos, which is basically me, that's also including that instructor-learner interaction, right? Going through the types of difficulties that we were having through the discussion, looking at the questions that we had, and then throwing up some new questions that are along the same lines, that take similar types of reasoning, but we've changed the text a little bit to try to facilitate some context transfer on the things that students are learning. So you see this embedded video here has 3 questions, and I did these in VidGrid. Again, you can make them very accessible because the captions are done automatically for us, and you can also use the feature where you can embed questions, and then you can make this a quiz or assignment within Canvas. And what it essentially does is, if you have questions built into the video, right, you can you can score it like any other quiz. Now, how I use them again is a formative assessment. It's not they're getting, it's kind of like taking attendance in a sense, to make sure that they're doing it and interacting with the content here. So the students have to stop, pause, and interact with what it is that they're learning. They can't just put it on play and then go outside or take a nap while it's running to get credit. So some more learner content interaction here. Zoom, right? So when we first started, we made the transition from face-to-face to online. We basically kept the course going, in a sense, the same way that we had been doing it. We met at the same time. It was a synchronous-based course. The last couple of weeks, we've actually transitioned to an asynchronous course. It's actually been, as a discipline-based education researcher, we find there's good silver linings in the natural experiment that has come before us, so we can start to experiment with the different types of modalities, because we have a lot of baseline data from students in face-to-face and previous sections. So we've looked at both synchronous and asynchronous, but here's an example where they would just come in and they do a Zoom lecture. We use the breakout rooms, we use the discussion forums, we do all of those sorts of things within Zoom. Next up would be the types of learner-learner interactions, right? So how do we get students talking with each other? So one good example is what we're doing right now, participating within a synchronous Zoom breakout room, right? And so a couple of examples of where we've used those Zoom breakout rooms would be within cooperative group problem solving. So we know that if you take students and you put them in groups and you have them work together on solving physics problems, it reduces the cognitive load on everyone, right? And so they're able to move through the types of more and more challenging types of physics problems. And so we had them doing that in the online space through Zoom breakout rooms. And here's an example where they're using the whiteboards to construct a framing for the problem. This is a torque balance, and you see it looks like there's a couple of lightsabers there, and I believe that's force lightning, I was being told that they're being zapped with. So they have just as much fun in Zoom breakout rooms as they do when they're in class, and you find some very, very interesting sketches. Another type of learner-learner interaction, again, where we use the Zoom breakout rooms synchronously, was the completion of labs, right? So we're a lab-based course, and in my course, the lab and lecture are in sync, like they're together. They take them at the same time, and so I was responsible for the lab component as well. And so what we did is we of course, the instrumentation that we were used to using is now locked away in a building that we don't have access to. So we had to switch to these digital simulations. And so we're using these online, what are called FETs. And we're using online digital simulations, and we're using some open educational resources that I was able to grab to construct labs. And we're doing them in the same format that we had been doing all semester. It's just now it's been digitized, and they work together in groups in a breakout room, all at the same time, just like they would have if they were face-to-face. Now, here's where we started looking, I really started looking at some asynchronous methodologies. So as an example, during my face-to-face classes, a significant chunk of the course is spent with student discussions. And so I might spend 5-10 minutes yammering on about some boring aspect of physics that I think is really exciting. And then I'm going to pause and I'm going to put a question. Usually it's a multiple choice question. And they all have these little paper cards that say A, B, C, D. They can fold them and they can hold them up. It's basically clickers, but low tech, and the batteries never die. And so they have those paper cards. They've been used to this, and we can still do this within Zoom very easily because we have the polling feature. In fact, I made a generic poll that it was just A, B, C, D, E, F, G, so I didn't even have to upload anything into Zoom, and it made it quite simple. And I can use all the PowerPoints that I had from the past, right? Well, how would I go about doing that same thing where I poll them, they show me their response, and then I say, find somebody you disagree with, convince them that you're right and that they're wrong. Have a discussion. We do that in class. We can do that on Zoom, but how do we go about doing that asynchronously, where everybody's in a different room? So I started messing around with the Canvas discussion boards, and this is actually a really interesting one here, a good example here where I pulled a few students. You can see I put little gray boxes, for covering up the actual student identities here, but here's a group of students talking about a question on buoyancy, where we have one that's essentially saying, I chose point C because it's enclosed by more oil, and then a response is, but they are at the same depth, and it goes into more detail. And then my favorite part is the response to that. The reply to that is, that's convincing, right? You've convinced me, right? They've had the whole semester to get used to this terminology of, convincing me that this is the answer. Now, one of the ways that we facilitate this and make sure that these types of interactions happen is I use a rubric to actually grade these discussions. So they have to post something before they can see any response, right? And then there's a rubric criteria on the quality of their post. I'm not asking for right answers. I'm just asking for something that's not like just C. Right? I need C, and I need a reasoning, right? And the reasoning can be, I don't know, because that is fundamentally feedback that we can use. And then there's another rubric criteria on how they interact afterwards, like finding somebody that they disagree with and trying to convince them that they are right, and or that they are convinced. Well, either one. Right? So that's one way that we've used the discussions, and it's actually worked very well, surprisingly well. I'm a little shocked by it. And then finally, there's the learner-instructor interactions. Learner-instructor interactions are how I interact now with the students, and how the students have the opportunity to interact with me. So one thing that I've been doing is frequent announcements. So I've been using the announcements feature somewhat frequently, posting short videos with my smiling face on different aspects of what's going on in the course. There's a video that's going live here in just a little bit for that class, explaining sort of the last couple of days. They have an exam that they had a week or so ago that's been graded, and they're going to have an opportunity to do rewrites on that, right? So I have little videos that keep popping up that explain all of this. So they're not really, they get to interact with me sort of in this asynchronous way, right? And they get to see my beautiful smiling face continuously, right? And then I've also participated within the discussion forums. This is an example of where I gave them a problem that was actually technically unsolvable. They loved that. Students absolutely love that. And I always tell them that, well, you need to be able to tell me why it's unsolvable. And I did that on purpose, right? Which is absolutely a lie. But, we figured that out, and I'm in the discussion forums with them. We can clear up any types of information that's going the wrong direction, right? Those sorts of learner-instructor interactions. And then, of course, I maintain office hours on Zoom consistently. every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for an hour. The students have been utilizing that fairly well. That's one of the reasons I knew that I gave them a problem they couldn't solve, because I got flooded on those online office hours. And so, basically, we maintained the types of interactions that we were having before. One thing I will say that I found very interesting anecdotally, going from face-to-face to online, is that I have become significantly more efficient. My lectures take much less time when you don't have an audience that's providing you with sort of instant feedback. So I found that I rant a little bit less. My jokes are a little bit more targeted and actually content related, right? And so I've become a bit more efficient at what I'm doing. I find that absolutely fascinating, and it's something I need to actually do much better job in class. There's another thing that I want to point out, and I had it in here somewhere, and maybe it disappeared. There it is, right there. So we were talking about the learner-content interaction. Not only did we have the synchronous Zoom sessions, but we also, it's all recorded. It's recorded in the cloud. And the students can go back at any time. And this is something that as soon as I get back into the classroom, I'm going to keep up, because it's been very effective, and the students absolutely have been thrilled that they can go back and they can watch the sorts of things, the sorts of discussions that we were having in the Zoom room. So I'm going to keep that up. It takes me no extra effort to build Zoom into Canvas, click a button at the start of class, right, and record everything that's going on within class, and then they can go back and look. So if you can't make it to class because you're sick, right, then you have the Zoom recording at a minimum, right? And then I'm curious as to whether that'll have any effect on my attendance. You might think that it would, but I'm not quite sure that it will, at least from the feedback I've been getting from my students this semester. So really, when we're looking at building a community of inquiry, and based on this framework, everything comes down to interactions. How does the student interact with you, the faculty member or instructor? How does the student interact with the content? And then and this is probably the most important one, how does the student interact with other students to actually make it a community of inquiry, as opposed to, a thing that they sit and they watch and, more YouTube videos, as a sense.